The airplane cabin was tense, filled with an unsettling silence. The hum of the engines barely masked the weight in the air. Daniel Carter sat firm, his fingers gripping the armrests, his pulse steady despite the turbulence outside. Across from him stood Logan Hayes, a flight attendant with an air of forced authority, his tone cool but unwavering. A few feet away, Victoria Langley, an elegantly dressed woman with an unmistakable air of entitlement, sat expectantly, a smug smirk playing at the edges of her lips. She was waiting for compliance, for Daniel to move. Then a voice cut through the tension. "Sir, you don't have to move. You paid for this seat. It's yours." Emily Brooks' voice was clear and unwavering. A ripple of support stirred through the cabin. A few rows behind, an older man, Harold Bennett, leaned forward. His voice, though soft, carried weight. "I see what's happening here, and I stand with you." One voice turned into two, then another. The passengers, once silent, had found their voices. Logan faltered. He had played this game before, pressuring passengers, expecting quiet compliance. But this time something was different. Then came Captain James Whitmore, his presence commanding, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked. Daniel exhaled, steady and calm. "I was asked to move without a valid reason. I declined." The captain turned to Logan. "Is there a policy violation? Any emergency requiring a seat change?" Logan hesitated. His usual script was crumbling. Victoria shifted in her seat, her confidence cracking. The weight of the passengers' stares bore down on them. Then the final blow. Emily's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her eyes flickering with recognition. "Media on standby. If they force him off, this goes public." She lifted her phone slightly, a silent warning. Logan saw it. So did Victoria. The power had shifted. Captain Whitmore's voice was firm. "Mr. Carter stays in his seat. Miss Langley, if you're uncomfortable, we'd be happy to arrange an alternative for you." Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. Her victory had crumbled. When the plane landed, it wasn't Daniel who was met by security. It was Victoria and Logan pulled aside for questioning. Hours later, the airline released a statement. "We deeply regret the treatment of Mr. Carter. The actions of our crew do not reflect our values. The individuals involved are no longer with our company." That evening, Daniel sat in his sister's art gallery, the weight of the experience still fresh. He let his eyes wander over Sienna's paintings, bold strokes of resilience and triumph. A reporter approached, microphone in hand. "What's the takeaway from this?" she asked. Daniel exhaled, his gaze steady. "That your place in this world is not up for negotiation. That standing your ground isn't just about a seat, it's about dignity. And sometimes the most powerful stand you can take is simply refusing to move." The screen fades to black, leaving a single question in bold white letters. If you were in Daniel's seat, would you have stood your ground? Emily Brooks had walked away from a 5-year relationship, leaving behind a carefully planned future that had crumbled into dust. This trip wasn't just about being there for Sienna Carter, it was about reclaiming a piece of herself. She had always been the planner, the problem solver, the one who held everything together. But now she was learning the hardest lesson of all: how to let go. She masked her pain with humor, throwing out witty remarks and playful jabs, but Daniel Carter saw through it. He always had. Beneath her easygoing front, he could still sense the weight of heartbreak, the unspoken fear that maybe she wasn't as strong as she wanted to be. Yet, despite her own struggles, Emily had an uncanny ability to focus on others. She had made it her mission to keep Daniel grounded, balancing tough love with quiet encouragement. She had always been both his anchor and his mirror, forcing him to confront his doubts rather than letting them consume him. As they settled into their seats on Flight 762, the familiar chaos of boarding filled the cabin. Passengers wrestled oversized bags into overhead compartments. Flight attendants recited safety protocols with well-rehearsed precision. The steady hum of the engines rumbled beneath it all, a constant presence. The seatbelt sign blinked above them, casting a rhythmic glow against the sterile lighting. To an outsider, it was just another flight, but Daniel sensed something beneath the surface, a subtle tension woven through the air. He observed the crew's smiles, polite, mechanical, but noticed how their eyes scanned the passengers, as if searching for something or someone. His seat, 14A, had a clear view of the wing, solid, steady, unmoving. He had picked it on purpose, knowing the tight rows in the back made his anxiety worse. Beside him, Emily had already unfolded a paperback, her go-to strategy for creating a bubble of calm. But even she seemed unsettled. Her eyes flickered over the cabin before dropping to her book, her fingers drumming lightly against the pages. Daniel reached over, giving her hand a brief squeeze. She looked up, offering a small, grateful smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. The overhead bins clicked shut one by one, sealing them in. The plane felt smaller, the air heavier. Daniel adjusted his seatbelt and exhaled slowly. It's just another flight, he told himself, just a few hours in the sky. But somewhere in the quiet corners of his mind, a whisper nagged at him. This isn't going to be an ordinary trip. As the plane rolled toward the runway, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real journey was only just beginning. He glanced down at the small velvet box in his hands, rubbing his thumb over its soft surface. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, adorned with tiny charms, paintbrushes, and palettes, a tribute to Sienna's love for art. It had taken weeks to find something that felt right, something as unique as her. He could already picture her face lighting up when she opened it. She had worked so hard to reach this moment, and her joy was the kind that could lift an entire room. Daniel wanted to soak it all in, to let her success remind him that dreams were still possible. His phone buzzed. A message from Sienna lit up the screen. I can't believe you're really coming. You're the best, Danny. He smiled, warmth settling in his chest. But beneath it was a quiet tremor of nerves. This wasn't just Sienna's big moment. It was his chance to break free from the weight of stagnation, to rediscover something, anything, that could pull him out of the rut he had been trapped in. He needed this trip to mean something. But as the plane filled up, as the aisles grew more crowded, an unease gnawed at him. It was subtle, like a shadow lurking just outside his field of vision. He couldn't pinpoint why, but he felt it. He turned to Emily. She had buried herself in her book again, but her fingers tapped lightly against the pages. She felt it too. Daniel shifted in his seat, trying to dismiss the feeling. It's probably nothing. Travel jitters, maybe. A mix of exhaustion and expectation. But his instincts had rarely been wrong. He took a deep breath and forced himself to focus on the good. Sienna's voice played in his mind, excited, full of hope. This was her moment, and he was here for it. Whatever was coming, he told himself, he could handle it. Excitement and nerves swirled inside Daniel Carter, a strange mix of emotions he couldn't quite shake. If you've ever had that feeling, where your heart cheers and holds its breath at the same time, you understand. The plane had just finished boarding when a flight attendant approached. His name tag read Logan Hayes, and his appearance was as crisp as the perfectly pressed creases of his uniform. His expression, however, was rigid, his smile the kind that had been practiced so often it no longer held warmth. "Excuse me, sir," Logan said, his voice smooth but firm. "We have a request. One of our passengers would like to switch seats with you. It would really help us out if you could move further back." Daniel looked up, his polite expression masking his confusion. "I'm sorry, but I'd prefer to stay here," he said. "I specifically chose this seat for the legroom." Logan's smile didn't waver, but Daniel caught the flicker of impatience in his eyes. "I understand," the flight attendant replied, "but this passenger has certain needs. We'd really appreciate your cooperation." From the corner of his eye, Daniel noticed Emily Brooks lowering her book, watching the interaction unfold with quiet intensity. His pulse quickened, a chill crawling over his skin. Something about this wasn't right. "Is there a medical issue?" Daniel asked carefully. Logan's jaw tightened. "Not exactly," he admitted, "but it would make things a lot easier." Before Daniel could respond, the sound of sharp heels against the aisle floor cut through the hum of the cabin. A woman stepped forward, impeccably dressed, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her expression was a blend of irritation and disbelief, as if she couldn't fathom why this conversation was even necessary. "I'm the passenger," she announced, her voice clipped and cool. "And I need this seat. I paid for comfort, and I have every right to sit here." Daniel blinked, trying to process the sudden escalation. Her tone wasn't just demanding, it was dismissive, as if he was merely an obstacle in her way, a minor inconvenience to be removed. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I also paid for this seat," Daniel said evenly. I chose it for the legroom, and I'd really prefer to stay where I am. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I don't see why you can't just move. It's not a big deal. I need more space, and I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for a little courtesy. The words were carefully measured, yet each syllable carried something sharper beneath the surface. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about who she thought she was, and, more importantly, who she thought Daniel wasn't. A shift rippled through the cabin. Passengers, once preoccupied with scrolling through phones or settling into their seats, had begun to take notice. Some leaned subtly into the aisle, their curiosity piqued. Others exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the tension. A few rows back, an older woman clutched her handbag tightly to her chest, her knuckles white. Across the aisle, a young couple whispered to each other, their faces a mix of confusion and discomfort. The overhead lights cast a dim glow, making every movement feel more pronounced, every glance more loaded. The normalcy of the flight had cracked, and an unsettling quiet filled the space where casual chatter had once been. Then, Victoria Langley's voice cut through the silence. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I shouldn't have to argue just to get a seat I need. What kind of service is this?" Her frustration was palpable, each word pressing down on the cabin like a weight. Standing over Daniel, Logan mirrored her energy. His professional mask had slipped, revealing a hardened edge beneath it. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time. Please move to the seat we've assigned you." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I've already said no. I paid for this seat. I'm not moving." Logan's expression hardened. "We can handle this here," he warned, "or we can take it off the plane. It's your choice." The air seemed to thin, every breath a little harder to draw. Beside Daniel, Emily reached for her phone, her fingers moving quickly as she typed a message. A quiet movement from behind caught Daniel's attention. Harold Bennett. The elderly man who had spoken up earlier shifted forward in his seat. His voice was soft but firm, a pebble against the growing tide. "I see what's happening here," he murmured, "and I want you to know, you're not alone." "I see what's happening here," Harold Bennett muttered, "and I'm with you." Under the harsh fluorescent lights, it became clear this wasn't just a disagreement over a seat. It was a battle of wills. One side armed with entitlement and authority. The other with nothing but quiet resolve. A storm brewed beneath Daniel Carter's calm exterior. Years of experience had taught him to pick his battles, to choose patience over confrontation. But the fresh sting of indignation pressed against those lessons. He had been here before. Not on a plane, but in life. Moments where he had to weigh the cost of standing his ground against the exhaustion of pushing back. The familiar voice in his mind whispered, "Just move. Avoid the escalation. Let it go." But another voice, one that had grown stronger after years of swallowing his pride, refused to be silenced. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about respect, about being seen, about not being dismissed. His pulse thrummed in his ears, each beat reminding him that if he let this go, it wouldn't stay here on this plane. He would carry it long after landing. Across from him, Emily Brooks saw the shift in his posture, the way his shoulders squared, the set of his jaw. Her instincts sharpened. She had seen this before. A look, a tone, a question asked with a sneer. She knew Daniel was more likely to absorb the hurt than to hurl it back. That thought sent a surge of protectiveness through her. Her fingers moved swiftly across her phone screen, sending a message to the one person who could help. "Dad, we might need help. Flight 762. A situation with Daniel." She didn't need to explain further. Her father would understand. When she looked up, she met Daniel's gaze, offering a small, steadying smile. Then, with quiet steel in her voice, she spoke, "You don't have to move. You paid for this seat. It's yours." The words weren't loud, but they cut through the thick air. A quiet, unyielding echo against Victoria Langley's sharp demands and Logan Hayes's growing impatience. She was ready for whatever came next, standing beside Daniel, not just as a friend, but as a witness, a shield, a reminder that he wasn't alone. Have you ever been in this position? Have you ever found yourself in a moment where standing your ground felt impossible? When every instinct told you to back down, to make yourself smaller just to keep the peace? It's a feeling many of us know too well. The way the air thickens around you, the weight of silence after you've said no, The realization that standing up for yourself might cost you more than just comfort. If you've been there, you're not alone. Your story matters. Whether it was a quiet moment or a dramatic showdown, whether you held your ground or walked away, sharing your experience could be powerful. It shows that every act of self-respect, no matter how small, is a step toward a world where everyone is seen and valued. Drop your story in the comments if you feel comfortable. You never know, your courage might be the inspiration someone else needs to find their own voice. Meanwhile, Emily's fingers flew across her screen. Her father's name hovered at the top of her recent messages. A civil rights attorney known for his calm but relentless pursuit of justice. She typed quickly. Flight 762. Situation with Daniel. Potential discrimination. Need advice. She hit send, her heart pounding as if the weight of the moment had lodged itself in her chest. Her movements stayed subtle. The phone held low in her lap, shielded by the seat in front of her. She had seen situations spiral before, not just with Daniel, but with others who had found themselves at the mercy of unchecked authority. Her father always told her, documentation is power. So she started recording. The phone rested against her knee, the camera lens peeking through a gap between the seats. And behind them, Harold Bennett leaned forward once more. A gentle, weathered face leaned forward. White hair curled over the edges of his thin wire glasses as he adjusted his hearing aid with a careful hand. His voice was soft but steady. "I see what's happening here," Harold Bennett murmured, "and I want you to know, you're not alone." Daniel Carter turned slightly, his expression a mixture of gratitude and surprise. Harold introduced himself. A retired teacher, someone who had spent decades witnessing injustice in quiet corners of classrooms and school hallways. He had seen too many people overlooked, dismissed, or pushed aside. "Hold your ground, son," Harold said. "If they try to make this something it isn't, I'll be right here. I've got eyes and ears, and I'm not afraid to speak up." The quiet solidarity in Harold's words wrapped around Daniel and Emily like a shield. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was solid. An unspoken promise that the truth would not be twisted without a fight. In a cabin full of strangers, they had found an unexpected ally, and that small shift in power strengthened their resolve. Logan Hayes' voice took on a sharper edge. The polished warmth of customer service was gone, replaced by something colder. "Sir," he said, his words clipped. "If you refuse to comply, we'll need to continue this discussion off the plane. I'm giving you one last chance to move voluntarily." The threat hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. A single step closer to a line that, once crossed, would change everything. Daniel felt his pulse in his throat, his hands damp against the worn fabric of the armrest. He had seen moments like this before, not just on the news, but in real life. A simple disagreement turning into something bigger. He knew how this could be spun, how easy it was for someone like him to be painted as the problem for simply holding his ground. His mind raced through every possibility. But no matter which path he took, he saw the same walls. Bias, misunderstanding, power. And then there was Victoria Langley. Her irritation had hardened into something colder, sharper. The corners of her lips curled into a small, satisfied smirk, as if she already knew how this would end. "I don't see why we're still talking about this," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "He's clearly being difficult. I paid for comfort. I deserve this seat." Her words weren't just a statement, they were a judgment. She spoke over Daniel, as if his voice was just background noise, an inconvenient static interruption in a story she believed she was writing. She didn't argue with him. She dismissed him, as if he was already gone, already removed, already forgotten. Beside him, Emily's mind was racing. She angled her phone just right, making sure to capture every word, every expression, because she knew this needed to be more than just Daniel's account. They needed proof. Her fingers tapped out another message to her father, her urgency growing. "It's getting worse. He's being threatened with removal." She glanced at Daniel. She saw the fear in his eyes. But more importantly, she saw his steadiness. He wasn't moving, not from his seat, not from his stance. And if he wouldn't back down, neither would she. Some stories matter too much to ignore. If this moment feels familiar, if you've ever been put in a position where standing your ground felt like the hardest thing to do, you're not alone. Moments like this happen everywhere. At work, in a crowded room, even with people who should be on your side. You know the feeling. The way the air thickens after you say no. The knot in your stomach when you realize that standing up for yourself might cost you more than just comfort. If you've ever been there, your story matters. Sharing these experiences is powerful, because every act of self-respect, no matter how small, is a step toward a world where everyone is seen and valued. Drop your story in the comments if you feel comfortable. Your courage might be the inspiration someone else needs to find their own voice. A new presence cut through the tension like a blade. The sound of measured footsteps. Then Captain James Whitmore stepped into the cabin. His uniform was crisp, every button polished, every crease sharp. His expression was unreadable, the kind of calm neutrality that came from experience. The hum of the engine seemed to dim as he approached. Even Logan Hayes took a step back, his usual confidence faltering in the presence of real leadership. When Captain Whitmore spoke, his voice was steady and measured. What seems to be the issue here? His gaze moved between Daniel and Victoria, one man sitting firm in his seat, one woman with her arms crossed, her nails tapping against her sleeve. Logan was quick to fill the silence, slipping back into his carefully rehearsed customer service tone. "Captain, this passenger," he nodded toward Daniel, "is refusing to move seats, despite a reasonable request from Miss Langley here. We've offered him an alternative, but he's not cooperating." For the first time, Daniel saw uncertainty in Logan's stance. Because now, the story wasn't just being told by the people in power. The truth was standing its ground too. "He's not cooperating," Logan Hayes repeated, his voice tight with forced authority. Captain James Whitmore turned his gaze to Daniel Carter, his expression unreadable but open. He wasn't rushing to a conclusion. "Sir," the captain said evenly, "would you mind explaining your side?" Daniel exhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady despite the pressure pushing down on him from every direction. "I paid for this seat. I chose it for the legroom. I was asked to move without a valid reason, and I've politely declined. I'm not causing a disturbance. I'm just asking to stay in the seat I purchased." A subtle shift flickered across Victoria Langley's face. Her frustration smoothed into something softer, a carefully practiced mask of mild distress. She turned toward the captain, her voice dipping into something gentle, something meant to sound reasonable. "Captain," she began, "I have a medical condition. I need more legroom, and I assumed this young man would understand. I wasn't expecting such confrontation." Her words dripped with careful victimhood, laced with just enough justification to make herself seem like the reasonable one. She adjusted her posture slightly, tilting her body in a way that suggested fragility, a need to be protected. It was subtle, but deliberate, a well-rehearsed play for empathy, one that had likely worked before. Then she cast a sideways glance at Daniel, a look designed to blend pity with accusation, as if his refusal to move wasn't just inconvenient, but offensive. But Captain Whitmore remained unmoved. His face gave nothing away as he looked back at Daniel, giving him space to respond. And in that silence, the weight of truth held firm, balanced against the well-worn armor of Victoria's entitlement. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Passengers who had been absorbed in movies, scrolling through their phones, or dozing against their windows were suddenly fully present. A few darted their eyes away when Daniel glanced back, not wanting to be caught watching. But others didn't. Some leaned slightly toward Daniel, their postures offering quiet support. Others exchanged hesitant glances, their expressions silently asking, "Is this just another travel inconvenience? Or is this something bigger?" The flight crew lingered at the edges of the moment, their professional masks cracking under the weight of the scene unfolding in front of them. And through it all, Harold Bennett remained a steady presence. His expression didn't shift, didn't waver. The quiet defiance in his stance was as firm as Daniel's refusal to move. Victoria's carefully constructed calm began to fracture. Her lips pressed into a thin line, the muscles in her jaw tensed. She had expected compliance, expected the world to bend around her. And when it didn't, her frustration twisted into something sharper. "This is absurd," she hissed under her breath, no longer bothering to hide her irritation. Her desperation wasn't the kind that came from genuine need. It was the kind that came from realizing the rules weren't working in her favor for once. That her expectations, ones that had likely been met without question before, were suddenly being challenged. Daniel, by contrast, seemed to draw strength from the resistance. His back straightened, his shoulders squared. There was no triumph in his expression, only resolve. He wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting not to lose himself. Not to yield to a demand that had less to do with a seat and more to do with being put in his place. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, measured. "I've said all I need to say," Daniel stated simply. "I paid for this seat. I'm not moving." Victoria's composure finally cracked. Her voice snapped, the smooth veneer shattered. "This isn't about the seat," she spat. "It's about respect. I'm a paying customer too. I shouldn't have to justify my needs to you." Her words twisted in the air, sharp, brittle, but beneath the anger there was something else. A fear. A fear of losing control, of being told no. And as the seconds passed, her desperation took on a new shape, one darker, more urgent, because with every breath, she felt it happening. The narrative she had crafted was slipping from her grasp. If you've ever felt like the world was trying to shrink your space, you know this feeling, that moment when your voice feels smaller, when someone else's expectations threaten to erase your presence. These stories aren't just about big confrontations. They're about the quiet, everyday battles, where dignity is on the line. If you've ever had to fight for your place, your voice, your right to simply exist as you are, your story matters. It always has. It always will. Emily's phone vibrated softly in her lap. She glanced down, shielding the screen with her hand. It was a message from her father. "Victoria Langley, senior executive at Langford Enterprises. Company has settled multiple discrimination lawsuits. Pattern of entitlement. Be careful." Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just a difficult passenger. This was someone who had been here before, someone used to bending the world to her will. And for the first time, Victoria Langley was realizing she had finally met a line she couldn't cross. Emily Brooks' pulse quickened. This wasn't just about a seat. Victoria Langley wasn't just another demanding passenger. She was someone with a documented history of using power to bend situations to her will. Her entitlement wasn't a fluke, it was a weapon. One she had honed and wielded with precision for years. Emily nudged Daniel Carter, subtly tilting her phone so he could see the message. His eyes scanned the screen. Then, a new understanding settled over him. This wasn't just a random clash of personalities. It was the latest act in a long-running play where Victoria always cast herself as the protagonist, where she expected others to step aside simply because they always had. And in that moment, Daniel felt the weight of it all. But instead of sinking beneath it, he found his footing. His fear melted into something clearer, more focused. He wasn't just defending his seat. He was standing against a pattern, against a story that had played out too many times before. A story where people like him were always expected to move, yield, disappear. Daniel looked at Victoria, his expression shifting. No longer just polite, resolute. "I understand now," he said quietly. "This isn't about comfort, is it? This is about control." Victoria's eyes narrowed. Her mask slipped just a fraction. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words stumbled behind a flash of uncertainty. For the first time, she seemed to realize something. The narrative had shifted. She wasn't the only one telling the story anymore. Daniel leaned forward slightly. His voice carried not just his own strength, but the strength of everyone who had ever been asked to give up their place. "I'm not moving. Not for you. Not for anyone who thinks they deserve more space in this world at someone else's expense." It was subtle, but profound. He was no longer on the defensive. He had drawn a line, clear and firm, and dared Victoria to cross it. The power had shifted, and everyone in the cabin could feel it. If you've ever watched someone struggle to hold their ground, or felt the world closing in around you, then you know. There is power in watching someone stand up and say, "Enough." Stories like this aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be shared. Because you never know who might need a reminder that their voice matters, that they aren't alone. That saying no isn't just a right, it's a necessity. If you know someone who needs to hear this, consider sharing it. Because sometimes the biggest impact comes from seeing a piece of yourself in someone else's story, from knowing that someone else has been there and come through the other side stronger, standing taller. Because the ripple effect of truth and courage can start with just one voice. Just one person, refusing to move. Victoria's calm veneer began to fracture. The carefully controlled facade cracked under the pressure of losing control. Her practiced smile slipped. A tightness crept into her eyes. A flush crawled up her neck. The entitlement that had fueled her every word now turned into raw desperation. She glanced around the cabin, searching for allies, but she found only watchful, weary eyes, passengers who had seen enough to doubt her story. The crisp assurance in her voice wavered. "This is absurd," she snapped, but the sharpness had dulled, the edge lost. "I shouldn't have to justify myself," she said, but the words lacked their previous force. "I've paid for my ticket. I deserve respect." But respect wasn't something you bought. It wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned. And as Victoria looked at Daniel and at the passengers whose silence had shifted into quiet resistance, it became clear. Her usual tactics weren't working. She was no longer the orchestrator of this scene. She was a character in a story slipping from her grasp. And then a soft voice broke through the tension. "Excuse me." Sophie Reynolds, a flight attendant who had been watching from a few rows away, stepped forward. Her demeanor was calm, her expression kind, but there was something else in her gaze. A quiet, unshakable certainty. Like she had seen this before. Like she knew exactly what was happening, and maybe, just maybe, she was done being silent. Sophie Reynolds leaned in close to Daniel. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, but her words carried weight. "I've seen this before." She flicked a glance toward Logan Hayes, who stood just a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest. "You're not the first passenger he's tried to intimidate." Daniel raised an eyebrow. Sophie continued, her tone firm but cautious. "He has a pattern. He targets passengers he thinks won't push back, people traveling alone, people who look like they might not have support. This isn't just about a seat. He's done it before, and he always finds a way to twist the story if things get messy." Her words added a new layer to the situation. This wasn't just about Victoria's entitlement. It was about a system that allowed someone like Logan to operate unchecked. Sophie's quiet bravery in stepping forward shifted the balance, because now Daniel wasn't alone, and neither was she. Meanwhile, Emily Brooks' phone buzzed again, a response from her father. "Media on standby. If they try to remove him, this goes public." The message was as clear as a battle cry. Her father had contacts at major news outlets, reporters who specialized in exposing injustice. One call, and this story would be everywhere, from social media feeds to evening broadcasts. Emily's fingers flew over her screen, her expression sharp with focus and urgency. She sent him the video recording she'd been taking. The footage captured everything. Logan's aggressive tone, Victoria's entitled demands, Daniel's calm refusal to comply. She knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about setting a precedent, about proving that some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. Daniel felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His pulse thrummed in his ears, each beat echoing the choice before him. He could let this go. He could surrender his seat, fade into the background, and slip back into the quiet shadows of keeping the peace. Or he could hold his ground, even if it meant stepping into a spotlight he never wanted. Hope and fear pulled at him, two sides of the same coin. But in the quiet strength of those around him, he found clarity. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been told to move, to shrink, to disappear. And with that realization, his decision became clear. He wasn't going anywhere. If you've ever stood your ground only to feel the weight of judgment pushing back, know this: you are not alone. Stories like this are more than just moments in time. They are threads in a larger tapestry, woven with resilience, courage, and quiet strength. By sharing stories like Daniel's, we aren't just recounting events. We are building a community. A space where your voice matters, where your experiences are seen and valued. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever found yourself in a moment where standing up for what was right felt like a battle against the tide? Sharing your story could make a difference, because even when it feels like the world is against you, there are others who understand, who will stand with you, even from afar. And your voice could be the encouragement someone else needs to find their own. Something shifted in the air. A change so small it was almost imperceptible, but undeniable. What had started as a quiet standoff over a seat had become something much larger. The story unfolding in row 14 wasn't just about personal comfort anymore. It had become a battle for justice. Daniel wasn't just holding his place. He was pushing back against a broader narrative, one where certain voices were dismissed, where compliance was expected without question. And for the first time, the power of expectation had cracked. The cabin, once filled with uneasy silence, now held a different kind of tension, the kind that precedes change. Passengers who had remained silent began to stir, murmuring softly to one another, sharing knowing looks. The tide was turning. Emily's quiet confession, Harold's steadfast support, Sophie's willingness to speak up. It had turned the tide. Even Captain James Whitmore, still standing firm and steady, seemed to acknowledge that this was no ordinary passenger dispute. Victoria's expression darkened. She felt it happening. The control she had wielded so confidently was slipping away. And for the first time, it wasn't Daniel who had to defend himself. The burden of explanation had shifted. Now, it was on those who had wielded their power carelessly. The story was no longer about whether Daniel would move. It had become about why he was asked to move in the first place, and what that request truly meant. It was no longer about whether Daniel Carter would move. It was about why he had been asked to move in the first place, and what that request truly meant. The plane touched down with a jolt, the wheels meeting the runway with a thud that reverberated through the cabin. But instead of the usual scramble of seatbelts unclicking, passengers stretching, and bags being shuffled, the plane remained under an unspoken tension. A silent expectation hung in the air. And when the cabin door finally opened, it wasn't Daniel who was met by security. It was Victoria Langley. Two uniformed officers stood at the entrance of the jet bridge, their expressions neutral but firm. They spoke quietly with Captain James Whitmore, who gestured toward Victoria. Her face, which had moved from smug to frustrated throughout the flight, twisted into disbelief. "There must be some mistake," she protested, but the edge in her voice was gone. For the first time, her words lacked the certainty they once carried. The officers didn't argue. They didn't justify their actions. They simply stepped aside, indicating the path ahead. Victoria's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for support, but the only looks that met hers were weary, unimpressed, and unyielding. She huffed, lifting her chin as if she still controlled the situation. And then, she walked off the plane. Her heels clicked against the metal floor, the rhythm sharp and hollow. Behind her, Logan Hayes remained rooted to the spot. His composure unraveled. Captain Whitmore approached, his quiet authority undeniable. "Logan," he said evenly, "I need you to speak with the airline representatives waiting outside." Logan's mask of professionalism cracked. His shoulders slumped, the weight of the moment sinking in. And as he shuffled down the aisle, step by step, he moved further away from the power he had clung to so tightly. Within an hour, an internal memo would circulate. Logan Hayes, suspended pending an investigation. The airline moved quickly. Statements were taken. Passengers who had witnessed the incident were encouraged to speak. And then, Sophie Reynolds stepped forward. Her testimony was clear and unwavering. She didn't just recount what had happened on this flight. She painted a picture of a pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long. It didn't take long for the story to break. Emily Brooks' father kept his promise. Within hours, news outlets picked up the footage, Emily's discreet recording, Harold Bennett's quiet but powerful support, Daniel Carter's calm resolve. And then, it spread. The story trended on social media, hashtags filled with "Stand your ground," "Justice for Daniel," "Bias in the skies." What had started as a private battle over a single seat had become a public reckoning, a moment that sparked a conversation far larger than the confines of row 14. Because this wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about every person who had ever been expected to comply without question. The voices of those who had witnessed the truth became a chorus, amplifying a message that could no longer be ignored. In the days that followed, messages of support flooded in from every corner. Strangers reached out to Daniel, sharing their own stories of quiet battles, stories of everyday injustices. His phone buzzed constantly, filled with notifications, interviews, and requests for comment. But amid the noise, it was the messages from those who felt seen and heard that resonated the most. He read every comment, every message, and in them he found solace, because his story was no longer just his own. It was woven into something greater, a thread in a larger fight for dignity and respect. When asked about the incident in a brief interview, Daniel's voice was steady, but filled with emotion. To everyone who believes in fairness, who stands up when it matters, thank you. Sharing stories like this isn't just about what happened to me. It's about building a world where justice isn't the exception, but the rule. When you share these stories, you become part of the change. You help show that dignity and respect are not negotiable. The airline had no choice but to respond swiftly. An official statement was released, not just internally, but to the public. We deeply regret the incident involving Mr. Daniel Carter on Flight 762. Our company strives to ensure that all passengers feel safe and respected. The actions taken by our staff did not align with our values, and we are taking immediate steps to address this failure. Their apology was followed by action. Logan Hayes' suspension became permanent. His history of misconduct was brought to light. New training programs were introduced, focused on bias, accountability, and customer relations. But more than that, the airline had to face the truth. Because now the world was watching, and this time they couldn't ignore it. The airline tried to make amends. They offered Daniel Carter a year of complimentary flights, a gesture of goodwill, an attempt to move forward. But more importantly, they made a pledge to listen, to learn, to rebuild trust, not just with Daniel, but with every passenger who stepped onto their planes. Because the ripple effect of this story was undeniable. What had started as a single voice refusing to yield had become a chorus, a reminder that change often begins with someone simply saying, "I won't move." The gallery buzzed with quiet energy. The hum of conversation filled the converted industrial space where Sienna Carter's art hung on pristine white walls. Daniel moved slowly through the exhibit. His eyes traced the vivid strokes of paint, the bold colors pulsing with life. Each piece was a testament to resilience. Abstract swirls of color that captured survival, portraits of faces that held untold stories in their eyes. Sienna's art had always been powerful, but here, in a room full of strangers who saw her truth and celebrated it, it felt transcendent. From across the room, Sienna spotted him. Her face broke into a radiant smile as she weaved through the crowd, wrapping him in a tight hug. "You made it," she whispered. "I knew you would." Daniel held her close, the weight of the past weeks melting away in the warmth of her embrace. She had always been his anchor, a reminder that no matter how far he drifted, he could always find his way back. Then, a reporter approached, microphone in hand. Daniel took a deep breath. The media attention hadn't completely waned since the incident on the plane, and he had learned to navigate these moments with a careful balance of honesty and strength. "Daniel, looking back, what do you think the takeaway from your experience should be?" He thought for a moment. The gallery lights cast a soft glow over Sienna's paintings, their colors reflecting back at him, and then he answered, "I think the biggest lesson is this. Your place in this world is not up for negotiation. Whether it's a seat on a plane or a spot at the table, you have the right to hold your ground. Too often, people who don't fit someone else's expectations are asked to move, to make themselves smaller. Daniel had been one of them, but he wanted people to understand. Refusing to be marginalized isn't just an act of defiance, it's an act of self-respect. His words rippled through the room, drawing quiet nods, murmurs of agreement, because it wasn't just his truth. It was a truth that so many others carried with them, too. Daniel hadn't set out to be a symbol of resistance. He had simply wanted to keep his seat, to hold on to what he had rightfully earned. But life has a way of turning small moments into pivotal ones, of taking an act of quiet courage and amplifying it until it becomes a chorus of voices refusing to be moved. As the cameras shut off and the crowd thinned, Daniel found a quiet corner of the gallery. He let his gaze drift over Sienna's favorite painting, a black feather suspended in a stormy sky, illuminated by a single beam of golden light. She had titled it "Wings of Resilience." And as Daniel stood there, something settled inside him, a blend of pride and peace. The storms he had weathered had finally settled into calm, because this was no longer just about a seat on a plane. It was about reclaiming his space in the world. He wasn't just surviving, he was standing tall, rooted firmly in the belief that he belonged. And in that moment, surrounded by art that spoke to every unbroken spirit, Daniel knew he had found his place. The screen dims, the echoes of Daniel's words hang in the air, like the final note of a powerful melody. The room fades into darkness, the hum of conversation, the quiet shuffle of feet, the flash of cameras disappearing into silence. And then, a single question appears, bold, white, unadorned. If you were in Daniel's seat, would you have stood your ground? The question lingers. If you were in Daniel's seat, would you have stood your ground? But this is more than a hypothetical. It's a challenge. A mirror held up to each of us. It asks us to consider not only what we would do in the face of injustice, but how often we find ourselves making small concessions. How often we give away pieces of ourselves just to keep the peace. It invites a moment of reflection. Where have you been asked to move, to shift, to make room where there was none for you? And what would happen if just once you didn't? In the stillness that follows, a gentle voice continues, not with an ask, but with an invitation. Because we need voices like yours. The stories that often go untold, the truths that linger in quiet spaces. When you subscribe, share, and join this conversation, you amplify stories of courage. You become part of a community that believes in fairness, a community that understands the power of a single voice saying, I will not be moved. Because this isn't just about what happened on that plane. It's about creating a world where everyone's seat is safe, everyone's place is respected, and no one is asked to disappear. These words aren't just a call to action. They are a reminder of the strength found in community. Because this isn't about likes, shares, or follows. It's about choosing to be part of a movement, one that values justice over convenience, truth over silence. It is an invitation to take a stand, not just for Daniel, but for anyone who has ever felt the world push them aside. As the screen begins to fade completely, a final message appears. Simple, profound. Sometimes, the most powerful stand you can take is simply refusing to move. The message lingers, glowing softly against the darkness, holding space for every viewer to find their place within the story. Because this doesn't just close a chapter, it opens a door to countless new ones, each one a testament to the unyielding power of a quiet, immovable no. The video fades to black. A silence remains, but it isn't empty. It is filled with possibilities. Somewhere, someone who felt invisible might now feel seen. Someone who had been shrinking might find the courage to stand tall. And somewhere else, perhaps on another plane, another bus, another boardroom, another voice will rise, steady, calm, refusing to give up its rightful place. Because now, they know they don't have to move. Thank you for letting me help bring this story to life. If you ever need more content like this, just let me know.